Okay, so this is a brief introduction, a little longer than brief, sorry, to the historical Arthur. And I think I mentioned before um, that when we imagine Arthur, the Round Table, Camelot, we usually think of this, for instance, film set, at least I do, film set for the film First Knight, starring Richard Gere as Lancelot. We often think of crenellated stone castles, chivalry, courtly love, jousting, etc., which we actually should think about because the myth was created and fleshed out between 1100 and 1500. That is, in sort of the later Middle Ages, when some places, this is obviously an idealized image, but might have resembled this. Okay. We know, and you know because I've mentioned it, that if Arthur did live, it would have been in sub or post Roman Britain around the year 500. Camelot would have looked a lot like these kinds of buildings that were found on hill forts, constructed out of largely wood, maybe some stone. Okay. So, what I find interesting about the Arthurian myth really is A, was he an actual historical figure? But also B, why is he still around? Why has the myth prevailed? Okay, so in terms of historical figure, how do we go about figuring this out? Well, to answer that question, we need just a little tiny bit of history. We can look at the historical and the archaeological record to see if there's any evidence for a leader of this stature. Some quick context. Now, the fall of the Roman Empire begins in the 200s or 300s, but by 400, Rome is basically calling back its troops down to Rome. Okay, we know that in Britain, coinage ceases in 402, meaning they're no longer paying their troops. Part of the function of the troops had been to hold back invaders or raiders, we might say, from Ireland and from Scotland and also from the continent. Once the Roman troops left, of course, a lot of people stayed, but you have an influx of people who at the time were seen as invaders. Today, these movements are referred to migrations. But the problem is you have quite a few hordes from this time period, right? Which suggests that people were in a hurry, right? Which also should suggest something stronger than a migration. You don't go bury all your stuff in the backyard, right? Unless something kind of catastrophic is happening. And by the way, we find the hordes because the people never returned to get them. Okay, so these quote invigrations, that's a term I've come up with, invasion migration, by the Angles and Saxons, largely from the continent, today's, just say roughly Germany, Denmark, continued through the 400s. And while we have a few sources from before 1000, um, or very few sources, I'm sorry, some that we do have mention a figure that appear to have held back the Saxons or the northern tribes for a time period, somewhere around Cornwall, which is down on the bottom of the map to the left there, or Wales, which is in the green on the western part of England, or perhaps in the north of England, in the area that today borders Scotland. Okay. So Saint Gildas, known as the Wise, was a monk living in Wales, that is on the western part of England. And he was presumably an eyewitness to some of these movements, these migrations or invasions of Angles and Saxons. And he has a work called Concerning the Ruin of Britain, written in 540. And the purpose of the work is to suggest that the Saxon invasions are a retribution for tyrannical rulers and morally corrupt clerics. That is, he sees collective sin as a cause for national calamity. Um, you'll notice here that he doesn't actually mention Arthur. He says, the poor remnants of our nation took arms under the conduct of Ambrosius Aurelianus, that's a nice Roman name, by the way, a modest man who of all the Roman nation was then alone in the confusion of this troubled period by chance left alive. His parents, who for their merit were adorned with the purple, had been slain. Adorned with the purple suggests they were some kind of royalty, right, or Roman nobility. He goes on, after this, sometimes our countrymen, sometimes the enemy won the field until the year of the siege of Mount Badon, which was, as I am sure, 44 years and 1 month before the landing of the Saxons, and also the time of my own nativity. And yet neither to this day are the cities of our country inhabited as before, but being forsaken and overthrown, still lie wasted. And so we have here somebody whose name at least starts with an A, whose parents are from the upper class, and we have reference to a major siege or battle. There's another Welsh source, the E. Godothan, from about 600. It's a collection of elegies commemorating a battle fought around the same time, about 600, in Wales against the Saxons, in which a tribe of 300 warriors was destroyed. The poet praises the fallen heroes, one of whom, he says, fought bravely, though he was no Arthur. And the assumption is that readers would have certainly gotten this allusion. That is, Arthur being a great warrior of some kind. Okay. Bede, known as the Venerable Bede, his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written in 730, is written after the Anglo-Saxons have settled in England. He basically plagiarizes Gildas. He describes the spread of Christianity and the efforts to reform the church to get it in line with Roman practices. And he sees Christianity as kind of a cultural cement, and he begins to Christianize the myth, which you'll see here. He talks about their first victory. And when the victorious army, having destroyed and dispersed the natives, had returned home to their own settlements, the Britons, that is, the native British, began by degrees to take heart and gather strength, sallying out of the lurking places where they had concealed themselves and unanimously imploring divine assistance, that they might not be utterly destroyed. They had at that time for their leader Ambrosius Aurelius, a modest man, who alone by chance of the Roman nation had survived the storm, in which his parents, who were of the royal race, had perished. Under him the Britons revived, and offering battle to the victors, by the help of God, came off victorious. From that day, sometimes the natives and sometimes their enemies prevailed, till the year of the siege of Bottisdown Hill, when they made no small slaughter of those invaders, about 44 years after their arrival in England. Okay? All right. The history of Britain was once thought to have been written by a figure called Nennius, a monk, who claims ownership of the manuscript, or in the prologue of one of the manuscripts. The author says that he, quote, made a heap of all that I have found, both from the annals of the Romans and the chronicles of the Holy Fathers, and from the writings of the Irish and the English, and out of the tradition of our elders. This account, Nennius, also originates in Wales. And the purpose seems to have been to both provide a noble lineage for prominent Welsh ruling families and to instill a sense of Welsh nationalism. That is, a unity and sort of common pride to create unity and common pride among the warrior class. And the account adds a few interesting details. the name Arthur, for instance, and that he carried an image of Mary on his shield. He says, at that time the Saxons grew strong by virtue of their large number and increased in power in Britain. Then Arthur, along with the kings of Britain, fought against them in those days, but Arthur himself was a military commander. The eighth battle, he gives a series of 10 or 12 battles. The eighth battle was at the fortress of Gunion, in which Arthur carried the image of Holy Mary, ever Virgin, on his shoulder, and that's probably a typo on the part of the scribe for shield. And the pagans were put to flight on that day. And through the power of our Lord Jesus Christ, and through the power of the blessed Mary, his mother, there was a great slaughter among them. The ninth battle was waged in the city of the Legion. I'll talk about this in a second. The 12th battle was out on Mount Badon, in which there fell in one day 960 men from one charge by Arthur. And no one struck them down except Arthur himself, and in all the wars he emerged as victor. So you're beginning to see here, obviously, some elements of myth, right? I mean, obviously, one man does not strike down 1,000 men. One thing I will notice is these series of battles that are mentioned here. People have a very hard time figuring out what names are referred to, but a scholar, Andrew Breeze, has recently suggested that all these battles took place in the north of England. Okay, so finally we have the Annals of Wales. It's a chronicle written in Latin covering about 500 years in time, starting from 447 and going up to almost the year 1000. And it's a collection of relatively obscure Welsh material, but it does contain two entries that are of Arthurian interest. In the year, for the Chronicles 72, but it's really the year 518. The Chronicle mentions the Battle of Badon, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and 3 nights, and the Britons were victors, whatever that means. 537. The strife of Camlon, in which Arthur and Mordred, looks like, fell, and there was death in Britain and in Ireland. And then my favorite entry in 573, Merlin went mad, as in crazy. Okay, and so what we can kind of conclude from these, and that's it, from these very few written sources, is that there was a military leader, probably from the area of Wales, maybe the north, Northumbria, a Roman descendant, maybe an early Christian, and that there was a battle, a major battle, perhaps at Badon, we're not sure where that is, but perhaps in Wales, against the Saxons. Because of his geographical range, both Wales and in the north, and his similarity to a number of historical tribal leaders, and the confusion of names, most scholars believe that Arthur ended up being a composite character, that is, representing a number of different leaders who fought off the Saxons. Okay, so the other thing we can do, you can look at written historical sources or you can look at archaeological sources. And there's been a lot of interest in hill forts, many of which date back to the Iron Age. I had to look up what age that is, but the Iron Age begins around 750 BC. And these hill forts were reoccupied after the Roman troops pulled out around 400, probably because they supplied a degree of safety. There are over 2,000 of these hill forts in England, and there are about 50 if you look at the lower, what do you call it, south west portion of England. There are about 50 in the southwest. There's some disagreement about what they were used for. Some say they were a defended settlement, which makes the most sense. Based on the artifacts they found there, some think they were basically sort of a status symbol or administrative center for local tribal leaders, maybe sacred centers, or maybe administrative hubs, or maybe a combination of these things. So one that has received the most interest is Badbury Rings, possibly the site of Mount Badon, right, or Arthur's military seat. We know that it was occupied before the Romans arrived in Britain, and then it was reoccupied from about 480 to 520. They know that because of coins they found, pottery, the remains of charcoal. It's about 300 feet high. The trenches are about 20 feet deep, and they would have had fences or ramparts on top of the trenches. This place is supposedly haunted. Night visitors have reported seeing a wounded warrior wandering around in the trees there. Um, but if a major skirmish did take place here, you would expect to find some kinds of remains of like weapons, for instance, or shields, which have not been found. Okay. Another site that has elicited a lot of interest is South Cadbury. It's one of the two largest sites in southwest Britain. Only about 6% of this area has been excavated, but they have found Saxon rings, brooches, and Roman and imported pottery. It was heavily fortified. Um, and it was destroyed by the Romans, but reoccupied, right, 470 to 580. That is, after the Romans had left and as the Saxon invasions were in process. It's about 500 feet high, 18 acres, and military historians say it would only have taken, seems like a lot to me, but 900 men to defend the hilltop. Post holes suggests that there was a very large feasting hall with various chambers, kind of a cross between like a mead hall and a villa. And it's also, tantalizingly, by the river Cam, C-A-M. And there's two villages, West Camel and Queen Camel, close by, right? Which would suggest some connection with Camelot. All right. My favorite is Tintagel, which is, of course, mentioned by Mallory. This is where Igraine, this is where Uther, presumably looking like, appearing as Igraine's murdered husband, comes and has sex with her a few hours after her husband has been killed. This site has ostentatious signs of wealth. They're not only coins, glassware, pottery, amphoras for oil and wine, all dating from the 300s and 400s. It also has ramparts that would suggest it was maybe a fortress or a royal seat. Other people have suggested it was a port for international trade, right? Although you could only, because of the weather and the winds, etc., will probably only use it in the summer. If you visit this place, it plays up the Arthurian connections. You can visit Merlin's Cave, which is down on the right there, the right lower photo. Yeah, Glastonbury Tor. This site had a large timber building also and a large latrine. There was also a forge with evidence of metalwork. Also a number of imported amphoras. Okay, so all this would suggest that perhaps this was a military seat. There's also a chapel, but there are a lot of animal remains, which makes some think there was maybe animal sacrifice going on, which is obviously not a Christian practice. Okay. It's close by a Christian community, an abbey or monastery that dates back to about 600, right? In 1191, probably as a fundraising technique, some monks claim to have found a tomb under their old chapel. They dug down 16 feet to find an oaken coffin with a lead cross that reads, "Here lies Arthur." interred in the island of Avalon. And the coffin contained a man with a massive head wound and a woman with yellow hair. This is at Glastonbury Abbey, and you can still visit it to this day. Okay, the last is Caerleon, the city of the Legion. This was a permanent Roman legionary fort. They broke camp and left around the year 400. But there's evidence that it was later occupied, right? The remains of the amphitheater, which you can see on the top photo, you can really clearly see that. In the bottom right-hand photo is a reconstruction. Sorry, my fat head is covering the left-hand reconstruction. The remains of the amphitheater have been associated with the Round Table. Perhaps it was used as a meeting place for Welsh royal councils. Okay, so the point in showing you all this is that we know that many of these hill forts were reoccupied after the Romans left, probably in response to the in-migrations. The problem is not much is left. England is marshy. There's stuff built, the stuff then was built largely out of wood. We have very few written records, right? And also, you had a number of, several different languages being spoken at the same time, and so place names change. Okay, so if we can't answer whether or not he existed, we might address briefly, as we're doing in this class, why his story was useful. And the story of the Arthurian myth seems to have always been useful during times of national crisis. The main attraction is the idea of a strong, unifying native English king who was able to hold off invaders, the Saxons, the later French Normans, Vikings, or the Germans in the 1940s, for instance. That is, it seems to me that the Arthurian myth represents a useful story of native resistance to invaders. And a pivotal moment in the development of the myth was the year 1066, when the Normans invaded England in a dispute over the throne. William of Normandy, and that's in northern France, claimed that Edward, the Anglo-Saxon king, had promised the throne to him. Edward died and passed the throne to Harold, who was an Anglo-Saxon royal thane or warrior. William of Normandy, known as, by the way, the Bastard, not because of his personality, but because his father had an affair. William got 700 ships, 8,000 men, and invaded England. The battle was decided at the Battle of Hastings in one day. The natives in England did not take this sitting down. There were uprisings all over, which were brutally put down. And William gave all of the large landed estates that were owned by the Anglo-Saxons, now known then as the English, to his own French warriors, right? And so this is sort of the beginning of this sort of gives rise for this desire, right, that they will have this great leader who will rise up and sort of expel the Normans or the French. By the way, William the Bastard became known as William the Conqueror after his successful battle. Okay, Geoffrey of Monmouth was a Welshman. He wrote the History of the Kings of Britain in 1135, that is 70 years after the Norman invasion. He claims it's a translation, but he probably made it up. There are 186 surviving manuscripts, which is an enormous number. For comparison, the Canterbury Tales, which is much newer, right? It's 200 years later. There's only about 80 surviving manuscripts. Geoffrey of Monmouth begins with the Trojans founding Britain, and he ends with the Saxon invasions and control around 600. The Arthurian material is in books 9 to 12. He invents Merlin. He makes Ambrosius Aurelianus, whose names we've heard, the brother of Uther. And Arthur goes on to defeat most of northern Europe. While Arthur is fighting in France, his nephew Mordred marries Guinevere and takes the throne. Arthur returns, he kills Mordred at Camlann, Camlann. Arthur's mortally wounded and he's taken to Avalon to be healed, right? And so this is being written during a time of civil wars as William the Conqueror's heirs are fighting for control. They're still trying to put down numerous native rebellions, right? And the Welsh were especially resistant to Norman rule, right? And so Geoffrey of Monmouth has a couple of themes. On the positive side, he suggests not only that the Welsh, but also the native Anglo-Saxons have a noble heritage that goes back to really Troy, right? And that they should have the hope that one day they will have a king of their own who will usher in national unity. The History of the Kings of Britain has also been read as a warning, however, to the Norman French rulers about how power leads to hubris or pride and overreaching, and serving as a warning, right, to these Norman French rulers of the need for national unity. And then, of course, we have our Thomas Malory. There are several versions. This is a very popular story, right? So in the couple hundred years that separate Geoffrey of Monmouth from Thomas Malory, you have French versions, you have British versions, etc. So there are a lot of different and there are a lot of different aspects to this myth, okay? As I'll tell you, if you haven't watched it yet, the background for Thomas Malory's version of the myth is the Wars of the Roses, which was probably the worst political crisis in England since the Norman invasion by William. It's interesting that Henry VII, Henry Tudor, who is Welsh, and who emerges as the victor in the Wars of the Roses after Richard III is killed, he names his oldest son Arthur. Arthur dies, of course. Henry VIII then kind of inherits. And Henry VIII has the so-called Round Table, which you see here on the right, painted with Tudor or royal colors and moved to Winchester, where Arthur at the time was thought to have lived, right, and is a home to the Winchester manuscript, which is a version that we are reading in this class. All right, thanks for listening. I know that was a little long.